blood on his hands had long since dried, but Frank Calloway could still feel it there, a phantom stain from wars he thought he'd left behind. 60 years his family had worked this Montana land, and in 60 days, the bank would take it all. The morning frost painted his failing fields white as he worked the fence line, his calloused fingers moving with mechanical precision. Some men are forged in fire, others in ice. Frank was both. When the first gunshots shattered the mountain silence, something ancient stirred inside him, muscle memory from battlefields half a world away. Not hunting rifles, military grade, automatic. They say a drowning man sees his life flash before his eyes. But a soldier sees only the next move, the next breath, the next kill if necessary. What he found in those woods wasn't just a child running for his life. It was a war Frank never enlisted for, fought on the land he was about to lose, with stakes higher than any flag he'd ever served. Some battles choose you. The morning frost clung to the barbed wire as Frank Calloway's weathered hands worked methodically, replacing rusted sections of the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of the Calloway Ranch. At 59, his movements still carried the precision of his Marine Corps training, though the years had slowed him some. The crisp Montana air burned his lungs as he exhaled, his breath forming clouds in the October chill. Black Ridge Valley stretched before him, once fertile land now parched from 3 years of relentless drought. 6 decades of Calloway stewardship hung in the balance, threatened not just by nature's cruelty, but by the $1.7 million mortgage that Granite Western Bank was all too eager to foreclose on in exactly 60 days. "Steady, Duke," Frank murmured to the aging border collie watching him work. The dog's ears suddenly perked up, head turning toward the dense pine forest that bordered the property. Frank paused, following the dog's gaze. Duke rarely reacted without cause. The crack of distant gunfire shattered the morning stillness. Not the familiar report of hunting rifles, these were automatic weapons, their distinctive chatter unmistakable to anyone who'd served in combat zones. Frank's muscles tensed instinctively as memories of Fallujah and Kosovo flashed through his mind. "Come on, boy," he whispered, retrieving the Remington 870 shotgun propped against his truck. Moving with practiced stealth, Frank followed Duke toward the tree line, staying low. The shooting had stopped, replaced by shouting in a language he didn't recognize, harsh, clipped syllables that definitely weren't Spanish or anything common to this part of Montana. Through a break in the trees, Frank spotted them, 3 men in tactical gear pursuing a small figure across the clearing ahead. A child, Frank realized with shock, no more than 12 or 13, clutching his side as he ran with faltering steps. The boy's face was streaked with dirt and blood, terror evident even at this distance. The armed men were closing in, shouting commands. One raised his weapon. Frank didn't hesitate. Years of civilian life fell away as training took over. He chambered a round and fired twice in rapid succession, the sound echoing across the valley. The first shot struck the dirt near the pursuers, forcing them to dive for cover. The second hit a tree trunk inches from the lead man's head. "U.S. Marines!" Frank bellowed with authority that belied his civilian clothes. "Drop your weapons." The armed men exchanged quick glances. Then one shouted something to his companions. 2 took defensive positions while the third continued pursuing the boy, who had collapsed behind a fallen log. Frank sighted carefully and fired again, this time hitting the pursuer's leg. The man went down with a scream. The others returned fire immediately, forcing Frank to duck behind a tree as bullets splintered bark around him. Duke barked frantically as Frank worked his way through the underbrush, using the terrain for cover. He'd spent his childhood hunting these woods, knew every hollow and ridge. These men, whoever they were, didn't. When he emerged 50 yards to their flank, he had the advantage. 2 quick shots, and another pursuer was clutching his shoulder, weapon falling to the forest floor. The third man, realizing he was outmaneuvered, broke for the deeper woods. Frank let him go. The boy was the priority. "It's all right, son," Frank called out, approaching the fallen log where the child had taken shelter. "They're gone. I'm here to help." The boy didn't respond. When Frank reached him, he found the child unconscious, blood seeping through fingers still clutched protectively against his side. Not a fatal wound, Frank assessed quickly, but serious enough. The boy's clothing was expensive, a private school uniform partially covered by a torn jacket. Around his neck hung a thin gold chain with a peculiar medallion. His dark hair was cut in a neat style that seemed distinctly European. Frank carefully lifted the boy, surprised at how light he felt. As he did, a small leather case fell from the child's pocket. A passport, Frank discovered, written in an alphabet he didn't recognize, though the boy's photo was clearly visible. There was also a heavy signet ring with an intricate crest and eagle over a mountain, surrounded by ancient text. "What have you gotten yourself into, kid?" Frank muttered, pocketing the items and carrying the boy toward his truck. He needed medical attention, but Frank's instincts warned against the hospital in Blackridge. Those men weren't common criminals, and they'd be watching official channels. The drive back to the ranch house was tense, Frank's eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The two-story white clapboard structure came into view, its wraparound porch and red roof a landmark in the valley for over a century. Frank carried the boy inside, Duke circling anxiously as he laid the child on the couch in the living room. Years of ranch accidents had made Frank proficient at emergency care. He cleaned and dressed the wound a deep graze rather than a penetrating injury and checked for other trauma. The boy remained unconscious but stable, his breathing even. Frank turned on the small television in the corner, scanning news channels for anything that might explain armed foreigners pursuing a child through Montana wilderness. The answer came quicker than expected. "Breaking news," announced a somber-faced anchor. "The State Department has confirmed reports of what's being called a terrorist kidnapping at the exclusive St. Martin's Academy in Switzerland. While details remain classified, sources indicate the target may have been the child of a foreign diplomat. FBI and international authorities are coordinating a response." Frank glanced at the boy on his couch, then at the foreign passport in his hand. The timing couldn't be coincidence. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation, Duke," he said quietly, drawing the living room curtains closed. The boy stirred 3 hours later, eyes flying open in panic. He scrambled backward on the couch, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured side. "Easy, son," Frank said, keeping his distance. "You're safe here." The boy's eyes darted around the room, assessing escape routes. "Who are you?" he demanded in perfect English, though with a distinct Eastern European accent. "Name's Frank Calloway. This is my ranch. Found you being chased by some men with guns who didn't seem to have your best interests at heart." Frank kept his tone matter-of-fact. "Mind telling me who you are and why they were after you?" The boy hesitated, caution warring with his need for help. "Thomas," he finally said. "My name is Thomas. My father is a diplomat. We were camping when they came. They killed our guide. I ran." The story was delivered with rehearsed precision that immediately raised Frank's suspicions. "That's so," Frank said, noting how the boy's eyes never quite met his. "Funny, because the news is reporting a kidnapping at some fancy school in Switzerland." A flicker of alarm crossed the boy's face before he controlled it. I don't know anything about that." Frank sighed, retrieving a glass of water and some pain relievers. "Look, son, I don't much care who you are right now. Those men will be looking for you, and they didn't strike me as the type to give up easy. The nearest town is 20 miles away, and I'm guessing you'd prefer I don't call the sheriff?" The boy Thomas, or whatever his real name was, accepted the water cautiously. "You shot them," he said. "Are they dead?" "Wounded 2. The 3rd ran off," Frank replied. "Military training. Marines. Long time ago." Some of the tension left the boy's shoulders. "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Calloway." "Frank's fine." He studied the child more carefully. Despite the dirt and blood, there was something in his bearing that spoke of privilege, the kind that came from more than mere wealth. "How old are you?" "Son," 13, came the quiet reply. Frank nodded. My boy was about your age when he decided he was too old for straight answers too. The comment drew a fleeting smile from the child. You hungry? The boy's eyes lit up at the mention of food, reminding Frank that whatever else he might be, he was still just a kid. Yes, sir. Very much. Frank prepared a simple meal of venison stew that had been simmering in the slow cooker since morning. The boy ate ravenously, manners momentarily forgotten in his hunger. Frank didn't press for more information, knowing trust would come gradually or not at all. After dinner, he showed Thomas to the small bedroom that had once belonged to his son Martin. The walls still bore faded posters of Montana wildlife and vintage military aircraft, untouched since Martin had left for the Army 8 years ago. Get some rest, Frank said. We'll figure things out in the morning. Later, with the boy asleep, Frank sat at his kitchen table cleaning his shotgun, the passport and ring placed before him. The passport was from a country called Kalmyria, a small Balkan nation, Frank vaguely recalled from news reports about democratization efforts after the Soviet collapse. The photo matched the boy upstairs, but the name printed beside it was certainly not Thomas. The ring was even more interesting. Its insignia matched the Kalmyrian royal crest Frank found after a quick internet search. Not a diplomat's son, then something far more complicated. Frank was still pondering this when headlights swept across his front yard. He doused the kitchen light and moved to the window, shotgun ready. A black SUV with government plates had parked beside his truck. A woman emerged, her stance and alert scanning of the surroundings immediately identifying her as law enforcement. Frank recognized her before she reached the porch. Elena Vasquez, FBI. They'd crossed paths 15 years ago during a joint task force operation in Kosovo that remained classified. She'd been a young field agent then. Now she moved with the confidence of someone who'd climbed several rungs up the bureau ladder. He opened the door before she knocked. Agent Vasquez, been a long time. Surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by professional composure. Gunnery Sergeant Calloway, I'd heard you settled in these parts. Her dark eyes, framed by silver-streaked black hair, assessed him carefully. Though I'm actually Assistant Director Vasquez now. Congratulations, Frank said, not moving from the doorway. What brings the FBI to my doorstep at this hour? Reports of automatic weapons fire near your property line. 3 hikers called it in. Her gaze moved past him, scanning what was visible of the house interior. May I come in? Frank hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Elena had been one of the good ones, straightforward, competent, and as honest as her job allowed. Coffee. Please. As Frank prepared the coffee, Elena took in the Spartan kitchen with its dated appliances and worn countertops. Photos on the refrigerator showed a younger Frank with his late wife Eleanor and their son Martin at various ages. How's Martin? She asked, accepting the steaming mug. Good, finishing his 3rd tour overseas. Army, not Marines, but I've mostly forgiven him for that. Frank managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, about those gunshots. Had some trouble with coyotes going after my calves. Might have gotten carried away. Elena didn't bother hiding her skepticism. Witnesses described what sounded like an exchange of automatic fire. Unless coyotes are shooting back these days, I'm thinking there's more to the story. Been some unusual activity in the area lately, Frank conceded. Strangers asking questions in town. Not locals, not tourists either. What kind of questions? About access roads, property boundaries. The kind of things people ask when they're looking for someone, not something. Elena set down her coffee. Frank, I need you to be straight with me. We have an international situation developing. A missing child, foreign nationals operating on U.S. soil without authorization, and now gunfire on your property. Frank met her gaze steadily. You know as well as I do that official channels aren't always the safest. Elena, especially when foreign governments are involved. A flash of understanding crossed her face. You've seen him. Frank neither confirmed nor denied. but his silence was answer enough. Elena lowered her voice. The boy is in serious danger. There are multiple parties looking for him, and not all of them have been properly vetted, meaning there could be moles in your operation, Frank concluded. It's a possibility we can't dismiss. She leaned forward. This isn't just about one child. Frank, there are diplomatic implications that could affect regional stability in Eastern Europe. Frank considered his options. Elena was probably trustworthy, but probably wasn't good enough when a child's life was at stake. If I happen to come across anyone matching your description, who should I tell them to trust? Elena reached into her jacket and withdrew a business card, writing a number on the back. This is my direct line. No switchboard, no assistant, just me. She slid it across the table. And Frank, be careful. These people aren't playing by any rule book you'd recognize. After she left, Frank stood on the porch watching her taillights disappear down the long driveway. The night had grown colder, stars brilliant in the clear mountain sky. He'd made a decision that could cost him everything. But looking up at the window of the room where the boy slept, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. What do you think, Ellie? He whispered to the memory of his wife, gone 12 years now, to the cancer that had ravaged her too quickly for goodbyes. One last mission for an old Marine. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying no answer but the one already in his heart. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Blackridge. From his vantage point on the ridge above town, Frank could see police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles congregating at the sheriff's office. Roadblocks were being established on the main highways. Looks like your friends are taking this seriously, he told the boy, who stood beside him at the truck window, ducking slightly to stay out of view. The child had been quiet since waking, the initial shock giving way to a wariness that seemed too practiced for his age. He'd accepted the borrowed clothes, an old flannel shirt of Martin's rolled up at the sleeves and jeans cinched tight with a belt without complaint. Not friends, the boy muttered. Those men, the ones who took me, they have connections. People working for them in your government. Frank glanced at him sharply. That's a serious claim. Son, it's true, the boy insisted. Why do you think I ran instead of going to authorities? Frank steered the truck away from town, taking a seldom-used logging road that wound through the national forest bordering his property. Maybe it's time you told me who you really are. The boy stared out the window, conflict evident on his young face. If I tell you, it puts you in danger too. I reckon I crossed that line when I shot those men, Frank pointed out dryly. After a long moment, the boy nodded. My real name is Theo. That's all I can say for now. Please. It wasn't much, but Frank recognized the offering for what it was, a tentative step toward trust. All right, Theo it is. Back at the ranch, Frank set about his daily chores, keeping Theo close. The boy watched with fascination as Frank checked on the small herd of cattle in the north pasture, repaired an irrigation pump, and split firewood for the coming winter. Despite his privileged background, Theo proved eager to help, asking thoughtful questions about ranch operations. My family has lands, Theo explained as he helped stack wood, but I've never been allowed to work on them, only to observe. Nothing teaches like doing, Frank said, demonstrating the proper technique for swinging the maul. My father put a shovel in my hands when I was 6. Said a man needs to know how his food gets to the table, how his house stays warm. Theo nodded solemnly. Your father was wise. By mid-afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Harold Mercer, loan officer from Granite Western Bank, his Mercedes looking comically out of place beside Frank's mud-spattered truck. Frank quickly directed Theo to wait in the barn, out of sight. Mr. Calloway, Mercer called, straightening his tie as he picked his way across the yard. Expensive shoes already soiled by the mud. I've been trying to reach you by phone. Reception's spotty up here, Frank replied, making no move to invite the man inside. Something wrong with our arrangement? Mercer's thin smile did nothing to mask his predatory intent. Actually, There's been a development regarding your property. The bank's board has reviewed your case and determined that the current extension may not be in our best interest. Frank's jaw tightened. We had an agreement. 60 days. Circumstances change, Mr. Callaway. Several investors have expressed interest in this parcel, particularly the northern section with its water rights. Mercer handed over an envelope. This is a revised notice. You have 14 days to bring the loan current, or we'll begin foreclosure proceedings. Frank didn't bother opening the envelope. This sudden interest wouldn't have anything to do with the mineral survey crews I've seen along the ridgeline. Would it? A flicker of surprise crossed Mercer's face. I'm not privy to all the bank's considerations. I'm merely the messenger. Then deliver this message back, Frank said evenly. The Callaway Ranch isn't for sale. Not to the bank. Not to your mysterious investors. I've got 60 days per our signed agreement, and I expect you to honor it. Mercer's cordial facade hardened. Don't be foolish. Frank, you're underwater on this property by nearly $2 million. The drought has decimated your herd. Your equipment is obsolete. The sensible thing would be to take whatever offer comes your way. Sensible isn't always right, Frank replied. Now, unless you've got a warrant, I believe you're trespassing. After Mercer departed, his Mercedes fishtailing angrily down the gravel drive, Frank found Theo watching from the barn doorway. Who was that man? The boy asked. Just a vulture circling, Frank said, tucking the envelope into his back pocket. Nothing to worry about. Theo's expression suggested he understood more than Frank had said. They want your home. They want the land, Frank corrected. This valley sits on the headwaters for 3 counties. Whoever controls it controls the water rights for thousands of acres. Valuable commodity in a drought. In my country, such men would disappear in the night, Theo said matter-of-factly, then seemed to catch himself. At least, that's what happened before my father. Before things changed, Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he gestured toward the farmhouse. Come on, let's get dinner started. You can tell me what your fancy school taught you about American history while we eat. The evening passed companionably, with Theo revealing a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of geopolitics, though he carefully avoided any specific references to his homeland. Frank, in turn, shared stories of Martin's childhood on the ranch, of Eleanor's garden that once produced the best tomatoes in the county, of simpler times before drought and debt had overtaken them. As darkness fell, Frank checked the perimeter of the property, setting up rudimentary alarm systems, tin cans on fishing lines strung between trees. Duke positioned in the mudroom where he could hear approaches from any direction. The shotgun remained within reach, joined now by the M1911 pistol Frank had kept locked in his bedroom safe since returning from his last deployment. Just after midnight, Duke's warning growl jolted Frank from his light sleep. He moved silently to the window, spotting movement at the edge of the driveway, the distinctive green glow of night vision equipment. At least 3 figures were approaching the house in tactical formation. Frank woke Theo with a hand over his mouth to prevent any startled cry. We've got company, he whispered. Follow me, stay low, and not a sound. The boy nodded, eyes wide but focused. Frank led him to the kitchen and opened a trapdoor hidden under the worn linoleum, revealing a root cellar that had been converted into a storm shelter. Get in. Stay quiet, Frank instructed, handing Theo a flashlight. Don't come out until I call for you. Once the boy was secure, Frank moved through the darkened house with practiced ease, positioning himself at a window with good sight lines to the approaching intruders. These weren't local law enforcement or even federal agents. Their movements were too precise, their equipment too specialized. The first man reached the porch, testing the door handle. Frank took aim and fired a warning shot into the porch ceiling. The response was immediate. The men scattered for cover, returning fire with suppressed weapons that shattered windows and splintered door frames. Frank rolled to a new position, using his intimate knowledge of the house to his advantage. A quick shot dropped one attacker as he tried to circle around to the back door. The others intensified their fire, forcing Frank to retreat toward the kitchen. Glass broke somewhere upstairs, indicating at least one more hostile had found entry. Frank grabbed a hunting knife from a drawer, knowing close quarters combat was now inevitable. The stairs creaked under careful footsteps as the intruder descended. Frank pressed himself against the wall beside the doorway, breathing controlled, muscles coiled. When the gunman's shadow appeared, Frank struck a sharp blow to the wrist that sent the weapon clattering, followed by a decisive thrust that found its mark beneath body armor. The man collapsed with a muffled cry. Outside, a vehicle engine roared to life. Headlights swept across the yard as the remaining attackers retreated, carrying their wounded. Frank waited, counting seconds, making sure it wasn't a feint. When convinced they were truly gone, he secured the house as best he could with broken windows and riddled doors, then retrieved Theo from the cellar. The boy emerged pale but composed. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately, eyeing the blood on Frank's sleeve. "Just a graze," Frank assured him, though the burn across his biceps suggested the bullet had done more than merely graze. "But we can't stay here. They'll be back with reinforcements." Theo nodded, a strange calm settling over him. "I'm sorry I brought this to your home." Frank studied the boy not with resentment, but with growing respect for his composure under pressure. "Not your fault, son. Now help me grab some supplies. We've got a long night ahead." They packed hurriedly food, water, first aid kit, ammunition, warm clothes. Frank retrieved a topographical map from his office, marking a route into the high country where he maintained a hunting cabin. Remote, defensible, and unknown to anyone except Martin. As they prepared to leave through a concealed back trail, Frank paused to look back at the house, the home he'd been born in, where he'd brought Eleanor as a bride, where they'd raised Martin until she grew sick. Bullet holes marred the white clapboard siding. Windows gaped open to the night air. One more piece of his life sacrificed to violence. "We'll come back," Theo said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I promise." Frank nodded, surprised by how much the simple reassurance from this mysterious child meant to him. "Let's move. Stay close to me, and step where I step." They slipped into the darkness, two figures soon swallowed by the vast Montana wilderness, leaving behind the flickering lights of emergency vehicles beginning to converge on the property. Whatever came next, Frank knew with certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The mountain trail narrowed as Frank led Theo higher into the rugged terrain of the Black Ridge Range. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the pine canopy. They'd been moving steadily for 4 hours, stopping only briefly to rest and dress Frank's wound properly. "How much further?" Theo asked, his voice tight with controlled fatigue. The boy had maintained a steady pace without complaint, but Frank could see exhaustion setting in. "Another 2 miles, Frank replied, checking his compass. "Cabin's tucked into a box canyon. Hard to find unless you know it's there. We can rest properly once we arrive." They pressed on, Frank occasionally pausing to obscure their trail or listen for pursuers. The attack on the ranch had been coordinated and professional, the kind of operation that required significant resources. Whoever wanted Theo was willing to expend considerable effort to find him. As they crossed a small stream, Frank noticed Theo staring intently at a news helicopter circling in the distance over what must be the ranch. "When I was in the Corps," Frank said conversationally, "we had a saying, 'Embrace the suck,' means when things get miserable, don't waste energy fighting the misery. Accept it. Work through it." Theo glanced up, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "In my country, we say the oak breaks in the storm, but the reed bends and survives." "Smart people, your countrymen." "Sometimes," Theo conceded. "Other times, very foolish." I mean, the hunting cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, a sturdy log structure nestled against a cliff face, partially concealed by surrounding pines. Frank quickly checked the perimeter before unlocking the reinforced door. Inside was sparse but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen area, and 2 bunks built into the far wall. "Solar panels provide basic power," Frank explained, turning on a battery-powered lantern. "Wood stove for heat, Propane for cooking, rainwater collection system feeds the sink. It's not the Ritz, but it'll do. Theo explored the cabin with curiosity, examining the few personal items, old photos, books, a carved wooden eagle that Martin had made in high school. You come here often, less than I used to, Frank admitted, setting their supplies on the rough-hewn table. Eleanor loved it up here. After she passed, it was too quiet. He busied himself starting a fire in the stove. Rest if you can. I'll take first watch. While Theo slept on one of the bunks, Frank scanned the valley below with binoculars. No sign of pursuit yet, but that wouldn't last. He turned his attention to the small battery-powered radio, tuning to the local news station. Intense manhunt continues for suspects in what authorities are calling a terrorist incident, the announcer was saying. FBI has established a command center in Blackridge, following a shootout at a local ranch that left one unidentified foreign national dead. Residents are advised to report any suspicious activity. Frank switched it off, rubbing his tired eyes. The official story was taking shape: terrorists, not kidnappers. Someone was controlling the narrative. When Theo woke several hours later, Frank had prepared a simple meal of canned stew heated on the propane stove. The boy ate ravenously, some color returning to his face. I need to know what we're dealing with, Frank said finally. You said these people have connections in our government? What exactly does that mean? Theo set down his spoon, weighing his words carefully. My father, he made changes in our country, democratic reforms. Not everyone approved. The old guard. They had arrangements with certain American companies, mining interests mostly. When my father canceled those arrangements, powerful people lost money. And these powerful people arranged your kidnapping as leverage, Frank concluded. Theo nodded. The plan was to use me to force my father to resign. The man who would replace him has already promised to restore the mining contracts. And where does Calmeria fit into this? Frank asked, watching Theo's expression carefully. The boy's eyes widened in shock. How did you... Found your passport, Frank explained. Can't read the language, but recognize the country name. Theo seemed to deflate slightly. Then you know I lied about being a diplomat's son. I figured that part out when I saw the royal crest on your ring, Frank said gently. No diplomat carries that kind of symbol. The boy was silent for a long moment, internal conflict evident on his face. Finally, he squared his shoulders. My name is Theodoros Alexandros. My father is King Nikolai III of Calmeria. He met Frank's gaze directly. I am the crown prince and only heir to the throne. Despite his suspicions, the confirmation still took Frank by surprise. That's quite a secret you've been carrying. Your Highness. Please, no titles, Theo said quickly. I've never liked them. My classmates at St. Martin's didn't know who I was. I was just Theo there. Frank nodded, respecting the boy's desire for normalcy. All right, Theo it is. But this does complicate things considerably. You'll turn me in now, Theo asked, resignation in his voice. No, Frank replied simply. Doesn't change the fact that someone tried to kill us both last night. Official channels are still compromised until we know who to trust. Relief washed over Theo's face. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Frank cautioned. We're still in a heap of trouble, but at least now I know what kind. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinct sound of a helicopter approaching. Frank moved quickly to the window, then relaxed slightly. It's a Black Hawk, military, not civilian or law enforcement. Is that good or bad? Theo asked, tensing. Depends who's flying it, Frank replied, reaching for his binoculars. As the helicopter descended into the valley below, he caught sight of a familiar figure jumping down before the skids had fully touched ground. Well, I'll be damned. What is it? Reinforcements, Frank said, a genuine smile breaking across his weathered face for the first time in days. My son Martin just arrived. The reunion between father and son took place in a small clearing half a mile from the cabin, Frank having decided against revealing the hideout's location until he was certain Martin was alone. The younger Calloway, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing, embraced his father fiercely. "When I heard about the attack on the ranch, I thought," Martin's voice caught, "thank God you're all right. Takes more than a few hired guns to bring down your old man," Frank assured him, though the bandage visible beneath his torn sleeve belied his casual tone. Martin nodded, eyes scanning the terrain with professional assessment. "My CO got me emergency leave when the FBI alert came through. Said it matched an intelligence bulletin about foreign operatives in the region." His gaze settled on Theo, who stood a few paces behind Frank. "I'm guessing this is why our home looks like a war zone." "Martin, meet Theo," Frank said simply. "He's in some trouble, and I've agreed to help." Martin studied the boy intently. "The kind of trouble that brings armed men to our doorstep." "That's the general idea," Frank confirmed. "Then I'd better hear the whole story," Martin said. "Preferably somewhere less exposed." Back at the cabin, Frank outlined the situation while Martin listened intently, occasionally asking sharp, specific questions that revealed his intelligence training. Theo added details about Calmeria, a small but strategically located nation with significant mineral deposits, particularly rare earth elements essential for advanced electronics. "The mining contracts my father canceled were destroying entire villages," Theo explained. "The American company, North Star Resources, was ignoring environmental regulations, bribing officials. When my father ordered operations suspended pending new agreements, North Star's stock dropped 40%. And certain shareholders weren't happy," Martin concluded, "including some influential Americans." Theo nodded grimly. "The opposition leader, General Dragomir, has promised to restore the contracts if he takes power. He's been meeting with North Star executives for months. That explains the resources behind your kidnapping," Martin said. "Private military contractors, intelligence assets, media management. North Star has deep pockets and deeper connections." Frank leaned forward. "You think they've compromised the FBI operation?" "Not the whole operation," Martin replied. "But I'd bet good money they've got at least one inside source. The response protocols, the roadblocks, everything's just slightly off. Like someone's steering the search away from certain areas. So we're on our own," Frank concluded. Martin shook his head. "Not entirely. My CO put me in touch with someone he trusts at the State Department. They're working to establish a secure extraction, but it will take time." He checked his watch. "Meanwhile, we should assume hostiles are closing in on this location. We need to keep moving." "The boy needs rest," Frank objected. "He's been through hell already. And it'll get worse if they find us," Martin countered. "I've got a vehicle stashed 2 ridges over. We can reach a safe house in Bozeman by nightfall." Frank recognized the logic but disliked leaving the security of the cabin. "What about Duke? I had to leave him at the ranch." "Sheriff Holbrook took him in," Martin assured him. "Said he owed you that much at least." The decision made, they gathered their supplies and prepared to move out. As they left the cabin, Theo paused at the threshold, looking back at the simple shelter that had briefly provided safety. "You'll see it again," Frank promised, understanding the boy's reluctance. "When this is over." "I hope so," Theo replied quietly. "It reminds me of our hunting lodge in the Calmerian Highlands. Before everything changed, my father would take me there every autumn. Just the 2 of us. No security, no protocols." The wistfulness in his voice reminded Frank forcefully that beneath the composed exterior was still a 13-year-old boy separated from his family, his home, everything familiar. "You'll see those highlands again too," Frank said, resting a hand briefly on Theo's shoulder. "That's a promise." They set off along a game trail that wound higher into the mountains, Martin taking point, Frank guarding their rear, with Theo protected between them. The sky had clouded over, promising rain by evening. The temperature was dropping, the October chill deepening toward the first hint of winter. After 2 hours of steady hiking, they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. In the distance, they could see vehicles moving along the highway, police cruisers and unmarked SUVs, search patterns coordinated but seemingly random. "They don't know where to look," Martin observed. "Good. Gives us a head start." As they began their descent toward the next valley, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the stillness. A bullet whined past Frank's ear, embedding itself in a tree trunk inches from his head. "Sniper!" Martin shouted, already pulling Theo to cover behind a large boulder. "Dad, get down!" Frank dove for protection as a second shot kicked up dirt where he'd been standing. From their position, he could see nothing of the shooter, just the distant tree line that offered 100 possible hiding spots. "How the hell did they find us?" Martin hissed, his combat training evident in his controlled breathing and precise movements as he scanned for targets. "Someone must have spotted the Black Hawk landing," Frank reasoned. "Tracked our direction from there." Another shot ricocheted off the boulder, sending stone fragments flying. Theo flinched but remained remarkably composed, his royal upbringing perhaps providing unexpected preparation for crisis. "We're pinned down," Martin assessed grimly, "and it'll be dark in a few hours. We need to move before then." Frank analyzed their surroundings, years of hunting these mountains providing intimate knowledge of the terrain. "There's a ravine about 50 yards east, leads to a stream bed that runs through a stand of pines. Good cover, hard to track. 50 yards of open ground," Martin noted. "Sniper will have a clean shot." "Not if he's distracted," Frank replied, already removing his jacket. "I'll draw his fire. You get the boy to the ravine." "Dad, no. Not a debate, son." Frank cut him off. "I know these mountains better than you. I'll circle around, meet you at the vehicle." Before Martin could object further, Frank had secured his jacket to a branch, creating a makeshift decoy. With practiced efficiency, he instructed Martin on the exact route to take, landmarks to watch for, and contingency plans if they became separated. "Ready?" Frank asked, and preparing to push the decoy into view. Martin's jaw clenched with reluctance, but he nodded. "Be careful, old man." "Always am," Frank replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Theo, you stay right with Martin. You hear do exactly as he says." The boy nodded solemnly. "I will. Thank you, Mr. Calloway." Frank gave them a 3 count, then thrust the jacket into the open. Immediate gunfire confirmed the sniper was still watching. Using the distraction, Martin and Theo broke cover, sprinting toward the ravine in a low crouch. Frank moved in the opposite direction, keeping low and using natural features for concealment. The sniper, realizing the deception, began firing wildly at moving shadows. Frank used the shooter's panic to pinpoint his location, a rocky outcropping about 600 yards distant. With Martin and Theo safely in the ravine, Frank changed tactics, becoming the hunter rather than the hunted. He circled wide, using draws and depressions to mask his approach. The sniper, focused on the ravine where Martin and Theo had disappeared, never saw Frank coming. The man was clearly professional tactical gear, high-end rifle with advanced optics. Radio equipment? Frank approached silently from behind, years of combat experience guiding his movements. When he was within 10 feet, a twig snapped underfoot. The sniper whirled, reaching for a sidearm, but Frank was already on him. A brief, brutal struggle ended with the man unconscious, his weapons disabled. Frank didn't kill him. Unnecessary death had never sat well with him, even in war zones, but he ensured the man wouldn't follow anytime soon, using the sniper's own equipment to secure him. A search of the man's gear revealed a satellite phone and a laminated card with frequencies and call signs. Frank pocketed these before heading toward the rendezvous point Martin had described, an abandoned fire lookout tower 3 miles northeast. The rain began as Frank descended into the valley, a cold, steady downpour that reduced visibility but also covered his tracks. He moved carefully, aware that the sniper might have teammates nearby. The forest thickened around him, old-growth pines creating a cathedral-like space where rain pattered on needles high above. It was in this setting that Frank encountered another unexpected figure, a man in a long black coat standing motionless in a small clearing, seemingly unbothered by the rain. His silver hair and ramrod-straight posture suggested military background, though he was clearly not American. "Mr. Calloway," the man called in a deep, accented voice. "I believe we should talk." Frank raised his pistol. "That's close enough. Who are you?" "My name is Victor Kazan," the man replied calmly. "Colonel, Calmerian Royal Guard. I believe you have been protecting my prince." Frank kept his weapon trained on the stranger. "If that's true, you're a long way from home, Colonel." "As is Prince Theodoros," Kazan acknowledged. "I have been tracking him since the kidnapping. Your assistance has been unexpected but appreciated." "If you're really his protection, where were you when he was being chased through my property?" Frank demanded. A flash of what might have been shame crossed Kazan's weathered face. "I was neutralizing the extraction team in Switzerland. By the time I realized the prince had been separated and transported to America, he was already in your care." He lowered his hand slowly. "I am alone, Mr. Calloway. I have no team, no backup, just a duty to protect my prince." Frank studied the man carefully. There was something genuine in his demeanor, a weariness that couldn't be faked. "How did you find me?" "I followed Assistant Director Vasquez," Kazan admitted. "She has been investigating the same elements I have, corrupt officials facilitating the kidnapping." "Vasquez is involved in this," Kazan nodded. "She is one of the few American officials I trust. We have history." The pieces clicked into place for Frank Elena's careful wording during their conversation. Her direct line offered without explanation. She'd been subtly directing him to make contact with Kazan. "The prince is with my son," Frank said finally, lowering his weapon slightly. "Heading for a safe house." "Then we should join them quickly," Kazan replied. "General Dragomir's men are closing in. The assistance they are receiving from within your government is concerning." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley, not the rhythmic beat of a Black Hawk, but the sharper cadence of civilian aircraft. "Search party," Frank asked, already knowing the answer. "Mercenaries," Kazan corrected grimly. "And they are not concerned with taking the prince alive anymore. Dead, he still serves their purpose, destabilizing Calmeria and forcing King Nikolai to negotiate from weakness." Frank holstered his weapon. Decision made. "Then we'd better move. The rendezvous point is a fire tower northeast of here." "Lead the way. Gunnery, Sergeant," Kazan said with a respectful nod. As they moved through the rain-soaked forest, Frank cast occasional glances at his unusual companion. "You know about my military service. I make it a point to know who is protecting my prince," Kazan replied. "Your record is impressive. Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, distinguished service. You have records from my deployments." Kazan's expression remained impassive. "Let us say that during the Cold War, I worked for organizations with excellent information-gathering capabilities." "KGB," Frank concluded, pieces falling into place. "Former," Kazan emphasized. "When the Soviet Union fell, many of us had to find new purposes. I found mine in service to Calmeria and its royal family." "Quite a career change," Frank observed dryly. A hint of a smile touched Kazan's lips. "Not as different as one might think. Both required absolute loyalty and a willingness to operate in shadows." The helicopter sounds grew louder, circling somewhere ahead. Frank quickened their pace, concern for Martin and Theo overriding his caution. The fire tower appeared through the trees, a weather-beaten structure rising 60 feet above the forest floor, offering a commanding view of the surrounding wilderness. At its base, concealed under camouflage netting, was a rugged Jeep Cherokee. No sign of Martin or Theo. "They should be here," Frank muttered, scanning the area for tracks. Kazan crouched, examining disturbed earth near the tower's ladder. They were, recently, but they left in a hurry. He pointed to scuff marks and broken branches. That way, into the heavy timber. They were being pursued. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. The helicopter. It appears they were spotted, Kazan agreed. We must move quickly. They followed the trail, Frank noting with pride that Martin had employed his training well. The signs were subtle, easily missed by anyone without tracking experience. They'd been moving fast but controlled, using natural features to break line of sight from above. The sound of gunfire erupted ahead short, controlled bursts followed by single shots in response. Frank broke into a run, Kazan matching his pace. They emerged from the tree line at the edge of a small mountain lake, taking in the scene with trained precision. Martin and Theo were pinned down behind the concrete remains of an old boat dock, taking fire from at least 3 positions along the shoreline. Martin was returning fire sparingly, clearly conserving ammunition. Cover me, Frank told Kazan, not waiting for agreement before sprinting toward a flanking position. Kazan needed no further instruction. He produced a compact submachine gun from beneath his coat and laid down precise suppressive fire, forcing the attackers to seek cover. Frank circled wide, using the distraction to approach the nearest gunman from behind. The man never heard him coming. A quick strike rendered him unconscious, his weapon now in Frank's hands. Using the superior firepower of the automatic rifle, Frank provided covering fire for Kazan to advance. The colonel moved with surprising agility for his age, reaching Martin and Theo's position in a controlled rush. The remaining attackers, now outflanked and outgunned, began a tactical retreat toward the helicopter waiting beyond the ridge. "Dad," Martin called, relief evident in his voice. "Over here." Frank joined them behind the concrete barrier, quickly assessing both for injuries. Martin had a graze along his temple, blood matting his short hair, but appeared otherwise intact. Theo was unharmed, though shaken. "Colonel Kazan," Theo breathed, recognition and relief washing over his face. "You found me." "Always, Your Highness," Kazan replied with formal respect, briefly dropping to one knee despite the circumstances. "You know him?" Martin asked sharply, weapons still raised cautiously. "He is my father's most trusted guard," Theo confirmed. "My godfather, though that is not officially acknowledged." Kazan rose, his attention already returning to their tactical situation. "The mercenaries are regrouping. We must move immediately." "The jeep's compromised," Martin reported. "They shot out the tires when we tried to reach it." "There is a ranger station 3 miles west," Frank said, recalling the topography. "Might have communications. Maybe a vehicle." "Too exposed," Kazan countered. "We need to contact Assistant Director Vasquez. She can arrange secure extraction." The distant helicopter was circling back, having collected its ground team. Frank made a quick decision. "Divided, we're vulnerable. Together, we have a fighting chance. Martin, you and Kazan take point. I'll guard our rear. Theo stays in the middle, protected." No one argued with the battle-tested strategy. They set off at a steady jog, using the lakeshore for cover before cutting into dense forest that would shield them from aerial observation. The helicopter continued to circle for several minutes before moving off to the east, presumably to refuel or reposition. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, away from established trails and toward the ranger station, Frank found himself repeatedly glancing at Kazan. There was something naggingly familiar about the man, beyond the colonel's admission of his KGB past. "We've met before," Frank said finally, when they paused to allow Theo to rest. "Haven't we?" Kazan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Kosovo, 1999. You were part of a Marine reconnaissance unit. I was advising Serbian forces." The memory clicked into place, a firefight in a mountain village. A Russian operative who had nearly killed Frank before disappearing into the chaos. "You shot me, and you broke my collarbone," Kazan replied with the faintest hint of respect. "A fair exchange. I thought—" Martin looked between them in disbelief. "You were enemies." It was a different world then, Kazan said simply. Different loyalties. And now, Frank pressed, now we share a common purpose, protecting the heir to Calmeria. Kazan's gaze shifted to Theo, who had fallen asleep against a tree trunk, exhaustion finally overtaking him. The boy is all that stands between my country and civil war. The ranger station appeared as the last light faded, a simple cabin with solar panels and a radio antenna rising from its metal roof. It was unoccupied, the Forest Service having reduced operations during the off-season. Martin quickly located the emergency radio and established contact with his military superior, who patched them through to Elena Vasquez. Frank, her voice crackled through the speaker. Thank God, we've been searching everywhere. We've got the boy, Frank replied, and your friend Kazan found us. A brief pause. Victor is with you. Good, listen carefully. We've identified the mole in our operation. Deputy Director Hargrove has been on North Star's payroll for years. He's been directing resources away from your actual location. Can you establish a secure extraction? Martin asked. Working on it, Elena replied. But it's complicated. Dragomir himself arrived in D.C. this morning for emergency consultations at the State Department. He's pushing for official recognition of his faction as Calmeria's legitimate government. Kazan's expression darkened. On what grounds he's claiming King Nikolai has fled the country, abandoning his position, without the prince to counter that narrative? My father would never flee, Theo interjected, having woken during the conversation. Never. Of course not, Your Highness, Elena assured him. But public perception is being carefully managed. We need to get you safely back to Calmeria as soon as possible. How? Frank asked. There's a private airfield 30 miles southeast of your position. Elena explained. I'm sending coordinates. A diplomatic flight from the Canadian Embassy will be waiting at 0600 tomorrow. Get the prince on that plane. And until then, Martin pressed, stay dark. Trust no one except my direct contacts. I'll send authentication codes through secure channels. The radio crackled with interference. Be careful, Frank. These people are playing for keeps. After the transmission ended, they secured the ranger station as best they could, establishing watch rotations for the night. Theo, despite his protests, was ordered to rest. The boy was asleep within minutes, the stress of the past days finally taking its toll. In the small kitchen area, Frank, Martin, and Kazan assessed their situation over cups of instant coffee. The timing is suspicious, Kazan noted. Dragomir arrives in Washington just as the search for the prince intensifies. He must believe we are close to being captured or killed. Or he knows something we don't, Martin suggested grimly. A sudden noise outside brought all three men to alert, weapons ready. Frank moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. A figure was approaching through the darkness, a lone woman, moving with purpose. It's Vasquez, Frank said with surprise. She's alone. Kazan joined him at the window, expression suspicious. How did she find us so quickly, and why come personally? Frank shared his concern. Martin, stay with Theo. Keep him away from windows. Kazan and I will handle this. They positioned themselves strategically, Frank at the main door, Kazan covering from an angle that would allow crossfire if necessary. When Elena's knock came, Frank called out, Authentication code, Sierra Echo, November 7-4. She replied immediately. Frank exchanged glances with Kazan, who nodded slightly. The code matched what they expected. Frank opened the door cautiously, weapon lowered but ready. Elena stepped inside, rain dripping from her jacket. Her expression was grim, exhaustion evident in the lines around her eyes. We have a problem. Hargrove wasn't working alone. We've identified a senator on the Intelligence Committee who's been feeding information to Dragomir's people. Which senator? Kazan demanded. Whitmore, Elena replied, naming a powerful committee chairman known for his hawkish foreign policy positions. He has significant investments in North Star resources. The mining contracts in Calmeria would be worth billions to his portfolio. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A U.S. senator involved in kidnapping a foreign royal. It gets worse, Elena continued. Whitmore's scheduled a committee hearing for tomorrow morning. They're going to formally recommend recognizing Dragomir's faction as Calmeria's legitimate government. Theo had appeared in the doorway, his young face set into determined lines. They cannot do this. My father is the rightful king, which is why we need to get you home immediately. Elena agreed. Plans have changed. There's a helicopter coming for us in 20 minutes. Marine Corps. Pilots I personally vetted. Kazan's suspicion remained evident. The original plan was a diplomatic flight at dawn. That was before we learned Whitmore's people had compromised the airfield. Elena countered smoothly. This is our best option now. Frank studied her carefully. Something felt wrong. Elena's appearance too convenient. Her explanation too neat. He caught Martin's eye, a silent communication passing between them. We appreciate the update, Frank said carefully, but I think we'll stick with the original plan. Better to wait for dawn than risk moving in the dark. Elena's expression hardened subtly. That's not advisable. Frank, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Nevertheless, Frank replied, hand drifting toward his holstered weapon. That's our decision. The standoff lasted only seconds before Elena's facade cracked. Her hand moved toward her jacket, but Kazan was faster. His weapon was already aimed at her head. Don't, he said quietly. You were always a poor liar. Agent Reynolds. Frank blinked in confusion. Reynolds was CIA, Kazan explained, never taking his eyes off the woman. Angela Reynolds, stationed in Belgrade during the Kosovo conflict. We crossed paths several times. The woman's posture changed entirely, the Elena Vasquez persona falling away. Hello, Victor. It's been a long time. Where's the real Assistant Director Vasquez? Frank demanded. Detained, Reynolds replied coolly. Temporarily. She'll be released once we secure the boy. You mean once you eliminate him? Kazan corrected. Dragomir doesn't want witnesses. Reynolds shrugged. Politics is a messy business. Calmeria's mineral resources are too valuable to leave in idealistic hands. Surely you understand that. Colonel, you've played the game longer than most. I played many games, Kazan acknowledged, but never with children's lives. A helicopter's distinctive thrum became audible in the distance, growing louder by the second. Reynolds smiled thinly. My extraction team is right on schedule. Last chance to cooperate. Gentlemen, Frank's decision was immediate. Martin, get Theo out through the back. Head for the ravine we passed earlier. Kazan and I will deal with this. Dad, go. Frank ordered, the command in his voice brooking no argument. As Martin hustled Theo toward the rear exit, Reynolds made her move, knocking a lamp from the table and lunging for Frank in the momentary distraction. She was professionally trained, her strikes precise and powerful. Frank defended himself, but age and his earlier wounds slowed his reactions. Kazan joined the fray, his fighting style distinctly Soviet in its brutal efficiency. Together, they managed to subdue Reynolds, securing her with zip ties from the Ranger's emergency kit. The helicopter's landing, Frank reported, peering through the blinds. At least 6 men disembarking. Go after your son and the prince, Kazan directed, checking his weapon. I will delay them. Frank hesitated. That's suicide. A grim smile crossed Kazan's face. I have survived worse odds. Besides, my duty is to protect the prince, whatever the cost. Something in the older man's resolute expression resonated with Frank's own code of honor. He nodded once, clasping Kazan's shoulder briefly before moving toward the back door. Calloway, Kazan called after him. In my country, we say the measure of a man is not what he owns, but what he protects. You have measured well. Frank acknowledged the unexpected compliment with a nod before disappearing into the night, following Martin and Theo's trail as gunfire erupted behind him. The sound of Kazan engaging the approaching mercenaries faded as Frank moved deeper into the forest. guided by starlight and decades of wilderness experience. He caught up to Martin and Theo nearly a mile from the ranger station, finding them huddled beneath a rocky overhang as rain began to fall again. "Kazan?" Martin asked, reading the answer in his father's expression. "Buying us time," Frank replied simply. "We need to keep moving. The airfield is still our best option." Theo's face was pale but composed. "Colonel Kazan has served my family for 30 years. He will not fall easily." "No," Frank agreed, hoping the boy's faith was justified. "He won't." They continued through the night, avoiding trails and open areas, moving steadily southeast toward the coordinates Elena had provided. The rain intensified, turning the forest floor treacherous with mud and concealing their tracks, but slowing their progress considerably. Dawn was breaking when they reached the airfield, a single runway cut into a high mountain plateau, a small terminal building its only structure. A Gulfstream jet with Canadian diplomatic markings waited on the tarmac. Engines idle. No other aircraft were visible. "Looks clear," Martin observed, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. Two pilots visible in the cockpit, one security officer at the stairs. "Canadian insignia checks out." Frank studied the scene carefully. "Could be legitimate, could be another trap." "We have to risk it," Martin replied. "The prince needs to return to Kalmyria immediately. Every hour he's missing strengthens Dragomir's position." Theo, who had remained stoic throughout their ordeal, suddenly clutched Frank's arm. "Mr. Calloway, I want to thank you for everything you've done." The formal phrasing couldn't mask the emotion in the boy's voice. "You protected me when you had no obligation to do so." Frank rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Eleanor, my wife, she always said the true measure of a person is what they do when there's no obligation, no reward. Just what's right." He smiled slightly. "Besides, you're a good kid. You're going to make a fine king someday." Theo straightened at that, a glimpse of the monarch he might become visible beneath the exhausted teenager. "I will remember what you taught me. About hard work, about standing your ground, about protecting what matters." "See that you do," Frank replied gruffly, unexpected emotion tightening his throat. "Now let's get you home." They approached the airfield cautiously, Frank taking point while Martin guarded Theo. The security officer spotted them immediately, speaking urgently into a radio. The aircraft's door opened fully, stairs extending. A familiar figure appeared, Elena Vasquez, the real one this time, her identification prominently displayed. "Authentication code Sierra Echo, November 7-4, she called. "Confirmed through diplomatic channels. The aircraft is secure." Still cautious, they advanced toward the plane. Elena met them halfway, quickly assessing their condition. "We've been monitoring Dragomir's communications," she reported. "He's expecting confirmation of the prince's death within the hour. When it doesn't come, he'll be exposed at the Senate hearing." "What about Colonel Kazan?" Theo asked urgently. Elena's expression softened. "Safe, Your Highness. Wounded, but alive. He's already been transported to a military hospital. He'll rejoin you in Kalmyria once he's stabilized." Relief washed over Theo's face. Frank found himself equally relieved the gruff Russian had earned his respect in their brief alliance. "And the ranch?" Frank asked as they neared the aircraft. "My property. That's, complicated," Elena admitted. "The attack left significant damage, and there's the matter of your mortgage." Frank nodded, resignation settling over him. The ranch had been living on borrowed time anyway. "As long as Duke's okay." "Actually," Elena said, "there's someone who'd like to speak with you about that." She gestured toward the aircraft door, where a distinguished older man had appeared. Even without formal introduction, Frank recognized King Nikolai of Kalmyria from news reports, tall, silver-haired, with the same intense green eyes as his son. The resemblance was unmistakable. The king descended the stairs with dignified haste, his attention fixed solely on his son. When Theo saw his father, the careful composure he'd maintained throughout the ordeal finally cracked. With a cry that was pure 13-year-old boy, He ran forward into his father's embrace. Frank and Martin stood back, giving the royal family their moment. The reunion was conducted in rapid Calmerian, but the emotion needed no translation relief. Joy, the profound connection between parent and child transcending politics and position. When they finally separated, King Nikolai approached Frank, extending his hand. Mr. Calloway, I understand I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Frank shook the offered hand. No debt, Your Majesty. Just did what needed doing. Nevertheless, the king insisted, Calmeria remembers its friends. He gestured toward the aircraft. If you would join us, there are matters I would discuss before we depart. Inside the luxurious jet, as Martin received medical attention for his wound and Theo changed into clean clothes more befitting his station, King Nikolai outlined a proposition that left Frank momentarily speechless. Our geological survey teams identified a substantial deposit of rare earth elements in Montana's Black Ridge Valley 3 years ago, the king explained. North Star Resources has been attempting to acquire properties in the region ever since, including your ranch. Frank's mind raced, connecting pieces that had eluded him. The sudden interest in my water rights, the pressure from the bank, all orchestrated by North Star, Nikolai confirmed. Your land sits atop one of the largest deposits of dysprosium in North America. Essential for high-performance magnets, electronics, renewable energy technology, worth billions, Martin concluded, rejoining them with a bandage on his temple. Precisely, the king agreed. Which brings me to my proposal. Calmeria wishes to establish its first joint American venture, a mining operation with exemplary environmental and labor standards. Contrary to North Star's typical approach, we would like your ranch to be the cornerstone of this project, with you retaining ownership and oversight. Frank struggled to absorb the implications. I don't know anything about mining operations, Your Majesty. But you know the land, Nikolai countered. You know the community, the people, and you have demonstrated judgment I would trust with my country's future and my son's life. He smiled slightly. The technical aspects can be managed by others. What cannot be replaced is integrity. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, arrangements were formalized with remarkable efficiency. The Calmerian Royal Treasury would immediately clear Frank's mortgage and provide capital for restoring the ranch buildings. A preliminary mining agreement would be structured to ensure sustainable practices and local employment. The Calloway family would retain controlling interest in perpetuity. There is one more thing, King Nikolai added as they prepared to say their goodbyes. Colonel Kazan speaks highly of your son's military expertise. We are restructuring our royal security detail and would welcome American experience. He glanced at Martin. Should you ever consider a change of service, Captain Calloway, Calmeria would welcome you. Martin appeared surprised but intrigued by the unexpected offer. I'll keep that in mind, Your Majesty. Final farewells were exchanged on the tarmac, Theo breaking protocol to embrace Frank fiercely. I will come back to see the ranch when it's restored, he promised. And perhaps you will visit our hunting lodge in the Calmerian Highlands one day. I'd like that, Frank replied, surprised to find he meant it. As the jet taxied for takeoff, Elena approached with news from Washington. Senator Whitmore has suddenly recused himself from all matters concerning Calmeria, citing potential conflicts of interest. Dragomir's faction is losing support by the hour. She smiled slightly. Amazing what happens when powerful people realize they're about to be exposed. Frank watched the aircraft lift into the brightening sky, carrying its royal passengers back to their distant homeland and the challenges that awaited them there. The past 4 days had transformed his world in ways he was still struggling to comprehend, from the brink of losing everything to an unexpected future, secured not by compromise, but by standing firm when it mattered most. What now? Martin asked as they began the long journey back to Blackridge. Frank considered the question, thinking of the damaged ranch house, of Duke waiting at the sheriff's office, of the valley that had been Calloway land for generations and would now remain so for generations to come. Now, he said simply, we go home. In the months that followed, Blackridge Valley witnessed remarkable changes. The Callaway Ranch was rebuilt, its historic character preserved while integrating modern improvements. Preliminary mining operations began with unprecedented environmental safeguards, employing local workers at wages that revitalized the struggling community. Frank found himself in an unexpected role, not just rancher, but liaison between Calmerian mining engineers and Montana regulators. Between corporate interests and community concerns, his straightforward integrity proved as valuable in boardrooms as it had on battlefields and mountain trails. Martin accepted a position with Calmerian Royal Security, dividing his time between Blackridge and the distant kingdom that had become an unlikely ally. His military expertise and frontier upbringing made him uniquely suited to training the next generation of guards who would protect Theo and the democratic reforms his father continued to champion. 6 months after the events that had brought them together, a package arrived at the ranch, a small wooden box containing a medallion bearing the Calmerian royal crest and a handwritten note from Prince Theodoros. "In my country," the note read, "we have an ancient tradition. When someone saves the life of a royal family member, they become guardian of the realm, not merely a title, but a bond that transcends distance and time. You taught me that a man's true wealth lies not in what he possesses, but in what he chooses to protect. I carry that lesson with me daily as I prepare for the responsibilities that await me. The oak stands firm against the storm, but the reed bends and survives. You are both oak and reed. Mr. Callaway, unyielding in principle, yet adaptable in method. I hope to be the same kind of king and the same kind of man. Until we meet again, Theo." Frank hung the medallion not in his office among business certificates, but in the kitchen beside Eleanor's faded photograph. There, as he started each day with coffee at the worn table that had survived the attack, it would remind him that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the simple decision to protect what matters, whatever the cost. And in a distant palace, a young prince studied Montana agriculture and American history alongside statecraft and diplomacy, preparing for a future shaped by the unlikely friendship forged in 4 desperate days on a struggling farm in the shadow of the mountains. The mountains of Montana stand silent, as they have for millennia, indifferent to the wars of men. But the land remembers. It bears the scars of bullets, the footprints of those who fled, and the blood of those who stood their ground. Frank Callaway moves across his porch at dusk, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunset paint the valley gold. The rebuilt barn gleams in the fading light. Where there was once desperation, there is now purpose. Where there was loneliness, there is connection. Some men spend a lifetime searching for meaning, only to discover it was waiting in the most unexpected places, in the courage of a royal child far from home, in the echo of promises made to those no longer here, in the simple act of standing firm when retreat seemed wiser. In his kitchen, the medallion from a distant kingdom catches the last light of day, hanging beside Eleanor's faded photograph. Not a reward for heroism, but a reminder that borders, oceans, and differences of birth mean little when measured against the bonds forged in fire.